Shadows in the alley. The cold evening air bit at Geraldine Brooks' face as she adjusted her scarf, carrying a bag of groceries through the quiet streets of her neighborhood. It was her usual Saturday routine, a trip to Mr. Jenkins' store for a few essentials, and maybe a chat with some friendly faces. For Mrs. Brooks, the walk was more than a necessity. It was a connection to the world outside her small, cozy home. At 72, she found joy in the little things: the smile of a neighbor, the scent of freshly baked bread, and the occasional compliment on her famous apple pie. But tonight, there was an unease in the air, a tension she couldn't quite shake. As she turned onto a dimly lit alley, a shortcut she'd used for years, a group of men emerged from the shadows. Their laughter echoed ominously, each note laced with malice. "Well, look who we have here," sneered the leader, a tall man with a snake tattoo winding up his arm. His voice was sharp and cruel, his posture that of a predator toying with prey. Mrs. Brooks halted, gripping her bag tighter. Her heart pounded, but her gaze was steady. "Just heading home," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "Wrong place, wrong time, Granny," one of the younger men mocked, stepping closer. His leather jacket glinted under the flickering streetlight. "I don't want any trouble," she replied, standing her ground. The leader chuckled darkly. "Trouble's already here." He snatched the bag from her hands, spilling the contents: a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a few apples, onto the damp ground. Mrs. Brooks felt a pang of anger but held her tongue. She had faced far worse in her life, raising her son Malcolm alone after her husband's untimely death. Malcolm, now a decorated general in the military, was her pride and joy. She had taught him resilience, and now she would lean on her own lessons. As one of the men shoved her shoulder, trying to unsettle her, Mrs. Brooks stumbled but didn't fall. She locked eyes with the leader, her voice firm. "You think this makes you strong? Picking on an old woman." The leader's smirk faltered for a split second before returning, more venomous than before. "You got a mouth on you, huh? Maybe we should teach you a lesson." Before he could act, the sound of screeching tires tore through the tension like a knife. A sleek black SUV roared into the alley, its headlights illuminating the scene. The vehicle came to an abrupt stop, and the driver's door swung open. Out stepped Malcolm Brooks, his military uniform immaculate, his chest adorned with medals. His presence was commanding, his every movement precise and deliberate. "Let her go," he ordered, his voice as sharp as steel. The gang froze, their bravado evaporating under his unyielding gaze. The leader's defiance wavered, but he managed to sneer. "And who's gonna make us?" "You." Malcolm stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Do you really want to find out?" The gang exchanged uneasy glances. One of the younger men muttered, "I don't know, man." He looked serious. "Shut up," the leader snapped, but his own confidence was crumbling. The standoff was interrupted by the distant wail of sirens. Malcolm's hand had discreetly triggered an alert on his phone, ensuring law enforcement would arrive soon. "You've got two choices," Malcolm said, his voice low and steady. "Walk away or face the consequences." The gang hesitated for a moment longer before the younger members bolted, their courage drained. The leader lingered, his face a mask of anger and humiliation, but eventually he too backed away, cursing under his breath. As the gang disappeared into the night, Malcolm turned to his mother, his stern expression softening. "Are you hurt?" Mrs. Brooks shook her head, though her hands still trembled. "I'm fine, Malcolm. You got here just in time." Moments later, the police arrived, taking statements and assessing the scene. Malcolm stayed by his mother's side, his protective presence unshakable. On the drive home, the car was quiet. Mrs. Brooks stared out the window, her mind replaying the encounter. "You shouldn't have had to come rushing to my rescue," she finally said. Malcolm glanced at her, his jaw tight. "It's my job, Mom. Always has been." As they pulled into her driveway, she reached out and placed a hand on his arm. I raised you to be strong, Malcolm, but don't forget, I'm strong too. I won't let them scare me away from my own home." He sighed, admiring her resilience. "I know, but I'm not taking any chances." That night, as Mrs. Brooks lay in bed, the echoes of the alley lingered in her mind. She had stood her ground, but the world was changing, and not always for the better. In the next room, Malcolm sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open, his focus sharp. He was already planning the next steps to ensure his mother's safety. Neither of them could have anticipated what would come next, a storm brewing far beyond their quiet neighborhood, one that would test their strength, resolve, and the bond they shared. Echoes of defiance. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Mrs. Brooks' modest kitchen as she prepared breakfast. The aroma of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee filled the air, but her movements were slower today. The events of the previous night weighed on her. She kept glancing at the back door, which Malcolm had double-checked before heading out to make calls and gather information. Her son's presence brought her immense comfort, but it also reminded her of the dangers that had found their way into her quiet life. Malcolm wasn't one to sit idle, especially when someone he cared about was threatened, and she knew he wouldn't stop until he resolved the situation. As Mrs. Brooks poured herself a cup of coffee, a soft knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. She hesitated, her heart racing, then glanced at the security system Malcolm had installed. The video feed showed a familiar face, Mrs. Andrews, her neighbor and longtime friend. "Geraldine, are you all right?" Mrs. Andrews asked as Mrs. Brooks opened the door. She held a plate of cookies, her concern evident in the tight lines around her mouth. "I'm fine, Margaret," Mrs. Brooks replied, though her voice betrayed her lingering unease. She stepped aside to let her friend in. "I heard about what happened last night," Mrs. Andrews said, setting the cookies on the counter. "It's all over the neighborhood. Everyone's talking about the gang, and that Malcolm came back just in time." Mrs. Brooks nodded, pouring her friend a cup of coffee. "I won't lie, it was frightening. But Malcolm handled it." Her voice steadied as she added, "He always does." Mrs. Andrews looked around the kitchen, her sharp eyes noticing the security upgrades Malcolm had installed. "Your boy doesn't mess around, does he?" "No, he doesn't," Mrs. Brooks replied with a hint of pride. "He's always been like that. Even as a child, he'd step in to protect anyone in trouble." As they sat down, Mrs. Andrews' voice dropped to a whisper. "Do you think they'll come back?" Mrs. Brooks sighed, her hand tightening around her coffee cup. "I hope not, but Malcolm thinks there's more to this than just a few thugs in an alley. He says the leader, Ray, I think his name was, looked like he was trying to prove something." Meanwhile, across town, Malcolm met his old military friend, James Reynolds, in a quiet diner. James was a tall, muscular man with a weathered face that spoke of years in service. He had answered Malcolm's call without hesitation, knowing his friend wouldn't ask for help unless it was serious. "Tell me everything," James said as he slid into the booth, his tone direct. Malcolm wasted no time. "There's a gang targeting my mom's neighborhood. It's not random. They're organized, deliberate. Last night wasn't just a scare tactic. They wanted to send a message." James raised an eyebrow. "And what message was that?" "That they can control the area," Malcolm replied. "But I'm not convinced it's just about them. This feels bigger. Someone's pulling their strings." James nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. "You think there's money involved? Land developers? Gentrification schemes?" "It's possible," Malcolm admitted. "I need to dig deeper, but right now my priority is keeping my mom safe. The gang scattered last night, but the leader, Ray, will regroup. He's not the type to back down." James leaned back, crossing his arms. "All right. First things first, we secure your mom's place, make sure she's protected. Then we find out who's behind this. I've got contacts who can help." As the two men strategized, Ray was holed up in a seedy bar with his gang, nursing his bruised ego. The leader's face was twisted with anger as he slammed his fist on the sticky table. "That soldier thinks he can humiliate me," he growled, his voice venomous. "Nobody makes a fool of me." The other gang members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a younger man named Carlos, finally spoke up. "Ray, maybe we should let it go. That guy wasn't normal. Did you see how he moved? He's trained." Ray shot him a withering glare. "Shut up, Carlos. I'm not scared of some uniform. He got lucky last night, but we'll make him regret stepping into our business." The room fell silent as Ray's words hung in the air. His bravado masked a deeper insecurity. He knew Malcolm wasn't just another mark. The soldier was a threat to everything Ray had built, and that was a challenge Ray couldn't ignore. Later that afternoon, Malcolm returned to his mother's house, his mind buzzing with plans. He had coordinated with James to bring in additional security measures, including a few discreet patrols in the neighborhood. As he stepped inside, he found Mrs. Brooks in the living room, chatting with Mrs. Andrews. The two women paused their conversation and looked up. "Malcolm, dear," Mrs. Andrews said with a warm smile. "It's good to see you again." "Mrs. Andrews," he replied, nodding politely. "Everything all right?" "Oh, we're just catching up," his mother said. "Margaret brought some cookies, but I saved you a few." Malcolm managed a small smile. "Thanks, Mom. I'll grab one later." After Mrs. Andrews left, Malcolm sat down with his mother. "We need to talk," he said, his tone serious. "James and I are putting together a plan to protect the neighborhood, but I need you to be careful. These people won't give up easily." Mrs. Brooks frowned. "Malcolm, I'm not going to live in fear. This is my home. I won't let them chase me out." "I know, Mom," he said, his voice softening. "But I need you to trust me. Let me handle this." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But don't forget, you're not alone. The people in this neighborhood look up to you. They'll stand with you if you let them." Her words stayed with Malcolm as he stepped outside, scanning the quiet street. The fight wasn't just about protecting his mother. It was about protecting the entire community. He knew Ray would come back, and when he did, Malcolm would be ready. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, Malcolm's resolve hardened. The gang had made the first move, but he would make the last. The shadowed truth. The next morning brought a quiet tension to the neighborhood. Residents exchanged wary glances as they went about their routines, whispering about the gang and the mysterious military man who had stood his ground. Malcolm's presence was both a comfort and a symbol of the danger lurking just beneath the surface. Malcolm spent the early hours coordinating with James and his contacts. By mid-morning, they had identified a few of the gang's known hangouts. Their focus was on finding Ray, but Malcolm suspected the gang leader was a pawn in a much larger game, gathering intel. James leaned over a table in Malcolm's makeshift operations room, a corner of his mother's basement lined with maps, photos, and notes. "I've been digging," James said, tapping on a laptop. "Turns out Ray's been involved in more than just petty crime. He's been running small-time intimidation jobs for a bigger fish, a real estate developer by the name of Marcus Doyle." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Doyle. That name's familiar." "It should be," James replied. "He's been in the headlines for years. On the surface, he's a philanthropist, funding community centers and schools. But beneath all that, he's orchestrating a scheme to buy up properties in low-income neighborhoods for pennies on the dollar." "Gentrification," Malcolm muttered. "Exactly," James said. "He uses gangs like Ray's to scare people into selling. When the neighborhood is empty, he redevelops it and sells it to the highest bidder. It's clean on paper, but dirty as hell in practice." Malcolm's mind raced. And now he's targeting this neighborhood. James nodded. "We need to find something concrete that ties Doyle directly to Ray. Otherwise, we're just chasing shadows." Meanwhile, in the den, Ray wasn't hiding. He was brooding. Seated in a dimly lit back room of a rundown pool hall, he stared at his phone, waiting for instructions from Doyle. The man hadn't called since the alley incident, and Ray's nerves were fraying. "Why are we just sitting here?" Carlos asked, pacing the room. "That soldier's making us look weak. We should hit back." "Shut up, Carlos," Ray snapped, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "We don't move until Doyle says so." "Doyle doesn't care about us," Carlos retorted. "He's just using us to clean up his mess." Ray slammed his fist on the table. "And you think I don't know that? You think I like waiting around? But Doyle's got money, power. You cross him, and you're dead before you even know it." Carlos fell silent, but the tension in the room thickened. Ray knew Carlos wasn't wrong, but defying Doyle wasn't an option. Not yet. The first move. By afternoon, Malcolm and James had a lead. One of Malcolm's contacts in law enforcement, Officer Elena Perez, had flagged a suspicious property owned by a shell company linked to Doyle. The property was a warehouse on the outskirts of town, rumored to be a hub for Doyle's operations. "We can't just waltz in there," James said as they reviewed the location. "Doyle's smart. He'll have security, maybe even more gang members." Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't have to waltz in. We just need to observe and confirm what's happening there." That evening, Malcolm and James parked a block away from the warehouse, using binoculars to scope the area. The building was heavily secured, with cameras on every corner and armed guards patrolling the perimeter. "Looks more like a fortress than a warehouse," James muttered. Malcolm's gaze narrowed. "He's hiding something. The question is what?" As they watched, a black SUV pulled up to the warehouse. Ray stepped out, flanked by two of his men. They were met by a man in a sharp suit, Doyle. Malcolm's grip on the binoculars tightened as he observed their interaction. "Ray's taking orders," Malcolm said. "Doyle's running the show." "Yeah," James agreed, "but we need more than that to take him down." As they continued to watch, Ray and his men unloaded several crates from the SUV. The guards carried them inside, but one crate fell, spilling its contents. Even from a distance, Malcolm recognized the unmistakable shape of firearms. "Doyle's arming them," Malcolm said, his voice grim. "This isn't just about scaring people. He's preparing for war." The neighborhood fights back. Back in the neighborhood, Mrs. Brooks was doing what she did best, uniting people. She had called a meeting of local residents, gathering them in her living room to discuss how they could protect themselves. "We can't rely on Malcolm and his friends to handle everything," she said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. "This is our home, and we have to stand together." Mrs. Andrews nodded in agreement. "We need to watch out for each other. If we see anything suspicious, we report it immediately." The residents shared stories of strange cars parked on their streets, of intimidating men lurking in alleys. They made plans to create a neighborhood watch, to install more cameras, to support one another in small but meaningful ways. As the meeting ended, Mrs. Brooks felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't a soldier like her son, but she was a fighter in her own right. Escalation. The following night, Malcolm and James decided to confront Ray. Armed with the knowledge of his connection to Doyle and the weapon shipment, they tracked him to the same pool hall. This time, they weren't observing. They were making their presence known. The room fell silent as Malcolm and James entered. Ray looked up, his expression a mix of surprise and anger. "What the hell are you doing here?" Ray demanded, rising from his seat. "We need to talk," Malcolm said, his voice calm but firm. "About Doyle. About the weapons. About the people you're hurting." Ray sneered. "You've got some nerve walking in here. You think you can scare me." "I don't need to scare you," Malcolm replied, stepping closer. "I just need you to think about how this ends for you. Doyle won't protect you when this all falls apart. You're expendable to him." Ray's bravado faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Get out of here before I make you." Malcolm didn't flinch. "You're running out of time. Ray, make the right choice before it's too late." With that, Malcolm and James turned and left, leaving Ray to stew in his own thoughts. A storm brewing. As Malcolm and James regrouped, the tension in the city reached a boiling point. Doyle was becoming more aggressive, Ray was growing desperate, and the neighborhood was on edge. The pieces were in place for a showdown, one that would determine the future of the community and the people Malcolm loved. But Malcolm wasn't just preparing for a fight. He was preparing to win. Lines in the sand. The neighborhood was quiet, but the air crackled with tension. Malcolm stood by the window of his mother's living room, scanning the street outside. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound sharper. He wasn't just on edge, he was prepared for war. Mrs. Brooks sat in her armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a blanket. She had lived through hard times before, raising Malcolm alone after her husband's death, working multiple jobs to keep their home. And now, this. But her composure wasn't just for herself, it was for Malcolm. She knew he carried the weight of protecting her and the community, and she refused to add to his burden by showing fear. "You can't stay up all night watching, Malcolm," she said without looking up from her knitting. Malcolm turned from the window, his expression softening as he looked at her. "I'll sleep when I know you're safe, Mom." Mrs. Brooks smiled faintly. "You've always been like this. Even as a boy, you'd sit outside my door when you thought there was trouble. But this isn't just about me anymore, is it?" Malcolm sighed, sitting on the edge of the couch. "No, it's not. Doyle's not just after this neighborhood. He's after control. If we don't stop him here, he'll just move on to the next place. And you think it's up to you to stop him," she said gently. "It is," Malcolm replied. "I can't stand by and watch people like Doyle destroy lives for profit. It's not who I am." Mrs. Brooks reached over and placed her hand on his. "You're a good man, Malcolm. Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," he said, though they both knew the risks he was facing. The call for reinforcements. As dawn broke, Malcolm met James in the kitchen, both men running on little sleep and a lot of adrenaline. James had been up all night compiling intel on Doyle's operations and the gang's movements. "We've got a problem," James said, sliding his laptop toward Malcolm. The screen showed a map with several highlighted locations. Doyle's ramping up his efforts. He sent reinforcements to the neighborhood. More hired muscle. More weapons. Malcolm's jaw tightened. "He's trying to intimidate us into silence." "Yeah," James said, "but it gets worse. I did some digging on one of his shell companies. They've got plans to bulldoze this entire area. Permits are already in motion. If he scares enough people into selling, he'll have the green light to start demolishing homes within weeks." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "Then we don't have weeks. We need to stop him now." James smirked. "That's the Malcolm I know. Always ready for a fight." Malcolm nodded, determination etched into his features. "This isn't just a fight. It's a mission. A rallying cry." That afternoon, Malcolm and James called a meeting of the neighborhood residents. People gathered in the small community center, their faces a mixture of fear and hope. Mrs. Brooks stood at the front with Malcolm, her presence a steadying force. Malcolm addressed the crowd, his voice strong and unwavering. "I know many of you are scared. I know you've heard about what's happening. And some of you might even be thinking about leaving. But I'm here to tell you this. You're not alone." The room grew quiet as Malcolm continued. "Doyle and his people think they can push us out, but they're wrong. This is our home, and we're not going anywhere. Together, we're stronger than they are." Mrs. Andrews stood up, her voice quavering but determined. "What can we do? We're not soldiers like you, Malcolm." "You don't have to be soldiers," Malcolm replied. "But you can stand together. Keep an eye on each other. Report anything suspicious, and most importantly, don't let them scare you into leaving." The crowd murmured in agreement, the initial fear giving way to resolve. Malcolm's words had struck a chord, and for the first time in days, the neighborhood felt united. A dangerous plan. Later that evening, Malcolm and James finalized their next move. They had identified another warehouse owned by Doyle's shell company, a likely hub for his gang's weapons and operations. "This is risky," James said as they reviewed the blueprints. "If we hit this place, Doyle will know we're coming after him." "That's the point," Malcolm said. "We need to draw him out, make him overplay his hand." James nodded. "All right, but we'll need backup. I've called in a couple of old friends. They'll meet us there." The warehouse raid. The warehouse was located on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by a chain-link fence and patrolled by armed guards. Malcolm, James, and their reinforcements approached under the cover of darkness, their movements silent and calculated. "Guards at every corner," James whispered, scanning the area through binoculars. "This won't be easy." "It never is," Malcolm replied. "Stick to the plan. In and out. No unnecessary risks." As they moved in, Malcolm took down the first guard with a swift, silent takedown. James and the others followed suit, neutralizing the perimeter security without raising an alarm. Once inside, they split into teams to search for evidence. Malcolm and James found a locked office at the back of the warehouse. Inside, they discovered a trove of incriminating documents, bank transfers, property deeds, and detailed plans outlining Doyle's scheme to displace residents. "This is it," James said, stuffing the documents into a bag. "This is what we need." But as they turned to leave, an alarm blared, flooding the warehouse with red lights. "We're made," one of their team members shouted. Guards poured into the warehouse, weapons drawn. Malcolm and James took cover behind a stack of crates, returning fire as chaos erupted around them. A narrow escape. The firefight was intense, but Malcolm's training and leadership kept the team focused. They fought their way to an exit, using the warehouse's layout to their advantage. As they reached the perimeter, James tossed a smoke grenade to cover their retreat. "Go, go, go!" Malcolm shouted as the team piled into their vehicles and sped away. Back at a safe house, they reviewed the documents they had recovered. The evidence was damning, tying Doyle directly to the gang's activities and the broader scheme to take over the neighborhood. "This is enough to bury him," James said, "but he's not going to go down without a fight." Malcolm nodded. "Then we'll be ready. Doyle strikes back." As Malcolm and James regrouped, Doyle received word of the raid. He sat in his opulent office, his face a mask of controlled fury. "They're getting too close," Doyle said, his voice cold. "We need to end this. Send a message they can't ignore." Clara, his sharp-eyed assistant, nodded. "I'll handle it." The next phase of the conflict was about to unfold, and Malcolm knew the stakes had never been higher. Doyle's retaliation would be swift and ruthless, but Malcolm was determined to protect his mother, the neighborhood, and everyone who stood in Doyle's way. A fire in the night. The neighborhood was cloaked in darkness, the streetlights casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Malcolm sat on the porch steps of his mother's house, his senses razor-sharp. The raid on Doyle's warehouse had shaken the enemy, but it had also provoked them. He knew retaliation was coming. The only question was when. Inside, Mrs. Brooks was watching the news, her knitting resting in her lap. The screen displayed a segment about the recent uptick in gang activity, but no mention of Doyle or his operations. She glanced toward the window, the faint outline of Malcolm visible through the curtains. She had always admired her son's courage, but tonight, a heavy dread weighed on her heart. The enemy moves. Across town, Marcus Doyle sat in his high-rise office, his fingers steepled as he listened to his assistant, Clara, outline their next move. "They've got the documents," she said, her tone crisp. "But they haven't gone public yet. That gives us a window to respond." Doyle's lips curled into a cold smile. "They're playing hero, trying to save that neighborhood. Let's remind them what happens to heroes." Clara nodded. "I've already dispatched Vance and his team. They'll handle Brooks and anyone else who stands in our way." "And the neighborhood?" Doyle asked. leaning back in his chair. "We escalate," Clara replied. "Fires, break-ins, anything to sow fear. If they're too scared to stay, they'll sell." "Good," Doyle said. "Make it quick." A blaze of warning. At precisely midnight, the first explosion ripped through the silence. Flames engulfed Mrs. Andrews' house, the fire spreading quickly through the old wooden structure. The sound of shattering glass and the acrid smell of smoke filled the air as neighbors poured into the street, shouting and pointing. Malcolm bolted upright at the sound, his instincts kicking in. "Mom, stay inside," he shouted as he grabbed his sidearm and sprinted toward the fire. Mrs. Andrews stood on her lawn, coughing and clutching her chest as the flames consumed her home. "Help! My house!" she cried, her voice hoarse with panic. Malcolm reached her side and guided her to safety. "You're going to be okay, Mrs. Andrews. Just stay here." James arrived moments later, his face grim. "This wasn't random." "I know," Malcolm said, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene. "This is Doyle's response." As they worked to help evacuate neighbors and contain the fire, Malcolm noticed movement in the shadows. A figure darted between houses, barely visible in the flickering light of the flames. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "James, cover me." He took off in pursuit, weaving through the alleys and side streets until he cornered the man in a dead-end alley. The man turned, breathing heavily, his face partially obscured by a hood. "Who sent you?" Malcolm demanded, his weapon trained on the man. The figure hesitated, then smirked. "Doyle sends his regards." Before Malcolm could react, the man tossed a smoke grenade to the ground. Thick, choking smoke filled the alley, and by the time it cleared, the man was gone. A united front. By morning, the neighborhood was in turmoil. Mrs. Andrews' house was reduced to a smoldering ruin, and the residents were terrified. Malcolm stood in the middle of the street, addressing the crowd that had gathered. "This is what Doyle wants," he said, his voice firm. "He wants you to be scared. He wants you to think you have no choice but to leave. But if we give in, he wins." Mrs. Andrews stepped forward, her frail frame trembling, but her voice resolute. "I'm not leaving. This is my home. He can burn my house, but he can't take my spirit." Her words sparked a ripple of determination through the crowd. One by one, the residents voiced their support, pledging to stand together against Doyle's tactics. "We'll fight," Mrs. Brooks said, her voice steady. "Not with weapons, but with strength and unity. This neighborhood is ours, and we're not giving it up." Malcolm felt a surge of pride as he looked at his mother and the neighbors. Their courage was a powerful weapon, one Doyle couldn't anticipate. A plan in motion. Back at his makeshift operations room, Malcolm and James reviewed the evidence they had gathered. The documents from the warehouse were enough to tie Doyle to the gang, the weapons, and the intimidation tactics. But they needed more, a public reckoning that would expose him completely. "We need to take this to the authorities," James said, scanning through the files. "This is airtight." "Not yet," Malcolm replied. "We take it to the authorities now. Doyle will have time to spin it, bury it, or worse. We need to hit him where it hurts first." James raised an eyebrow. "And where's that?" "His image," Malcolm said. "Doyle thrives on his reputation as a philanthropist and community builder. If we show the world what he really is, he won't have anywhere to hide." Doyle's next move. In his sleek office, Doyle was pacing, his calm exterior cracking under the pressure. The fire had sent a message, but the neighborhood wasn't backing down. Worse, Brooks was still out there, gathering evidence and rallying the community. Clara entered the room, her expression unreadable. "We've confirmed that Brooks has the documents from the warehouse. He's building a case. Then we need to shut him down," Doyle said. "Permanently." Clara hesitated. "We've already escalated with the fire. If we push too hard, it could backfire." Doyle glared at her. "We're already in too deep. Take care of it." A tense night. As night fell, Malcolm's preparations were complete. Security cameras monitored every corner of the neighborhood, and a network of residents kept watch from their windows. But Malcolm knew Doyle wouldn't stop with just one fire. He sat in the living room with his mother, the tension palpable. Mrs. Brooks reached over and took his hand. "You've done everything you can, Malcolm. The rest is in God's hands." Malcolm nodded, but his mind was racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The ambush. Around midnight, a group of masked men crept through the shadows, their movements silent and deliberate. Vance, the leader of the mercenaries, signaled for them to spread out, their target clear: Malcolm Brooks. But Malcolm was ready. The first man tripped a motion sensor, triggering a floodlight and a blaring alarm. Malcolm and James were already in position, their weapons drawn. "It's showtime," James muttered. The mercenaries opened fire, but Malcolm and James were faster, their military training giving them the edge. The firefight was intense, the quiet neighborhood erupting into chaos. Residents peeked from their windows, terrified but unwilling to abandon their homes. Vance, realizing the mission was failing, barked an order: "Fall back." But Malcolm wasn't letting them escape. He pursued Vance through the alleys, finally cornering him near a fence. "You messed with the wrong neighborhood," Malcolm said, his voice cold. Vance smirked. "You think this ends with me? Doyle's got more resources than you can imagine. You can't stop him." "We'll see about that," Malcolm replied. As police sirens approached, Malcolm handed Vance over to the authorities. It was a small victory, but the war was far from over. The strike that echoed. As the last of the mercenaries were subdued and hauled off by law enforcement, the neighborhood began to stir. Lights flickered on in houses as residents cautiously stepped outside, their fear giving way to curiosity and concern. Mrs. Brooks was among them, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders as she hurried toward her son. "Malcolm," she called, her voice trembling. "Are you all right?" Malcolm turned from the police officer he was speaking with, his face softening when he saw her. "I'm fine, Mom," he said, stepping forward to reassure her. "It's over." "For now," James added grimly, joining them. "This was just a skirmish. Doyle won't stop because we took out his mercenaries. If anything, he'll double down." Mrs. Brooks looked between the two men, her eyes narrowing. "Then we double down too. We can't let him win." Debrief at the safe house. Later that night, Malcolm and James regrouped at a safe house on the outskirts of the neighborhood. The documents they had collected from the warehouse lay spread across a large table, illuminated by a single desk lamp. It was a trove of incriminating evidence, but it wasn't enough to end Doyle's operations. "We've got bank transfers, weapons deals, and links to the gangs," James said, pointing to specific files. "But there's nothing here that ties Doyle directly to the fire or the attacks on your mom's neighborhood. Without that, he'll spin this as rogue elements acting on their own." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "There has to be something we're missing. Doyle's too smart to leave a direct trail, but someone in his organization knows the truth." James hesitated, then pulled out a burner phone. "There's one person who might help. I've been in touch with a source inside Doyle's operation. He's low level, but he's seen enough to know how Doyle works. If we can convince him to talk." Malcolm nodded. "Set it up. We don't have time to waste." The fire's aftermath. The next morning, the neighborhood gathered in front of Mrs. Andrews' house. The charred remains of her home stood as a grim reminder of Doyle's ruthlessness. But the community was not defeated. "We're rebuilding," Mrs. Andrews declared, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. "I'm not leaving, and I'm not giving Doyle the satisfaction of thinking he's won." Her words were met with cheers and nods of agreement. Malcolm stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as the people he had grown to admire banded together. His mother joined him, her expression resolute. "They're stronger than they look," Mrs. Brooks said, pride evident in her voice. "They are," Malcolm agreed, "but they shouldn't have to do this. Doyle's the one who needs to be stopped. The informant. That evening, James arranged a meeting with his informant, a nervous man named Greg who worked in the financial department of one of Doyle's shell companies. The meeting took place in an abandoned warehouse, its empty halls echoing with the faint sound of dripping water. Greg arrived, his hands shaking as he clutched a manila folder. "This is everything I've got," he said, his voice trembling. "Emails, transfer records, even a few recordings. But if Doyle finds out I'm talking to you..." "He won't," Malcolm assured him. "You're doing the right thing." Greg handed over the folder, his eyes darting around the room. "Doyle's planning something big," he said. "He's panicking after the raid. He knows you're closing in, so he's trying to force the issue. Another fire. Maybe worse." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "Where?" Greg hesitated. "There's an apartment complex near the edge of the neighborhood. A lot of families live there. Doyle's been talking about making an example out of it." Malcolm exchanged a glance with James. "We need to move now. A race against time." As Malcolm and James drove toward the apartment complex, they coordinated with the police and fire department, alerting them to the potential attack. The neighborhood watch was also mobilized, residents armed with cell phones and flashlights patrolling the streets. The apartment complex was quiet when they arrived, but Malcolm's instincts told him something was wrong. He and James split up, carefully searching the perimeter. They found nothing at first, but then James spotted a van parked in the shadows, its windows blacked out. "That's them," James whispered, gesturing for Malcolm to join him. The two men approached the van, weapons drawn. As they neared, the back doors burst open, and a group of men jumped out, armed and ready for a fight. The final stand. The ensuing battle was brutal and chaotic. Malcolm and James moved with precision, using the van and nearby cars for cover as they exchanged fire with Doyle's men. The sound of gunfire echoed through the night, drawing the attention of the neighborhood watch and the arriving police. One of Doyle's men lit a Molotov cocktail, aiming for the apartment building. Malcolm acted on instinct, firing a single shot that shattered the bottle in the man's hand before it could be thrown. Flames erupted around him, but the building remained untouched. As the police closed in, the remaining men surrendered, their resolve broken. Malcolm approached the man who had held the Molotov, grabbing him by the collar. "Tell Doyle this ends now." The turning tide. With the attackers in custody and the apartment complex unharmed, the tide began to shift. The evidence provided by Greg, combined with the events of the night, gave the police the leverage they needed to launch a full-scale investigation into Doyle's operations. Back at his mother's house, Malcolm sat at the kitchen table, exhaustion etched into his face. Mrs. Brooks placed a steaming cup of tea in front of him and sat down across from him. "You did it," she said softly. "You protected us." Malcolm shook his head. "It's not over yet. Doyle's still out there. But you've shown him that we won't be bullied," Mrs. Brooks said. "That we're stronger together." Malcolm nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, we are." The battle was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like victory was within reach. The neighborhood had stood its ground, and Doyle's grip was slipping. Malcolm knew the final confrontation was coming, and he was ready. The reckoning. The quiet after the chaos of the previous night was deceptive. Though the neighborhood appeared calm, Malcolm knew better. Marcus Doyle wasn't the type to retreat quietly. For Doyle, this wasn't just about profit anymore, it was personal. The damage Malcolm and his team had done to his operation, his reputation, and his plans had left Doyle exposed, and men like him only became more dangerous when cornered. A turning point. The morning sun cast long shadows across Mrs. Brooks' neighborhood as Malcolm walked the perimeter of her home, checking every camera, every sensor, every possible entry point. Inside, James was updating the secure laptop with the information provided by Greg, cross-referencing it with the files from the raid. The evidence was now overwhelming. Doyle's empire of shell companies, gang affiliations, and illegal tactics was laid bare. But Malcolm knew they needed more than documents. They needed Doyle himself. James joined him outside, handing over a steaming cup of coffee. "The pieces are all here," he said, "but we're missing the final move. Doyle's not going to let this go. He's too arrogant to cut his losses." Malcolm took a sip, his mind already working. "He's not just arrogant. He's desperate. Desperation makes people sloppy." James smirked. "So what's the plan?" "We set a trap," Malcolm said. "Force Doyle to act on his arrogance and make a mistake." Doyle's descent. In his high-rise office, Marcus Doyle's patience was wearing thin. Clara stood before him, her tablet glowing with updates on the fallout from the apartment complex debacle. The arrests, the neighborhood's resilience, and the growing attention from law enforcement were unraveling his carefully constructed empire. "Brooks is playing hero," Clara said, her voice measured. "And he's winning. The neighborhood's united behind him, and we're losing ground." Doyle slammed his fist on the desk, his composure slipping. "I don't care about the neighborhood anymore. I care about Brooks. He's made this personal, and I want him dealt with." Clara hesitated. "We still have resources, but if we push too far, we risk exposing the entire operation." Doyle leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Push harder. Burn it all if you have to. Make an example of him." Setting the trap. That evening, Malcolm and James put their plan into action. They spread word through trusted contacts that Malcolm had secured evidence powerful enough to dismantle Doyle's entire operation. The rumor was carefully crafted to reach Doyle's ears, and they knew it wouldn't take long for him to act. The bait was set. Malcolm's safe house on the edge of the neighborhood. It was a controlled environment, reinforced and monitored, designed to look like a weak point while providing every advantage to Malcolm and his team. As they prepared, Mrs. Brooks insisted on helping, despite Malcolm's protests. "I won't sit by while you risk your life," she said, her voice firm. "You may be a soldier, but I'm still your mother. Let me help." Reluctantly, Malcolm agreed. Mrs. Brooks joined the neighborhood watch in securing the area, ensuring every resident was accounted for and every exit was covered. The attack. The trap was sprung just after midnight. A convoy of black SUVs rolled into the neighborhood, their headlights cutting through the darkness like predatory eyes. Inside the lead vehicle sat Doyle, flanked by 2 armed guards. His face was a mask of fury and determination. The SUVs stopped outside the safe house, and the armed men began to pour out. They moved with precision, their weapons drawn, their steps deliberate. Doyle's voice crackled over a radio, directing the assault. "Find Brooks," he ordered. "Bring him to me." Inside the safe house, Malcolm and James monitored the advancing team through a network of cameras. The neighborhood watch had been cleared from the immediate area, and law enforcement was on standby, waiting for Malcolm's signal. "They're coming in heavy," James said, adjusting his rifle. "This guy doesn't do subtle." "He doesn't need to," Malcolm replied, his voice calm. "He just needs to think he's in control." The ambush. As Doyle's men breached the safe house, Malcolm and James sprang into action. The first wave of attackers was met with controlled fire, Malcolm's military precision turning the chaotic assault into a calculated counterstrike. James held the rear, cutting off their retreat with strategically placed traps. From his SUV, Doyle watched the operation unfold, frustration mounting as his men struggled to gain ground. "What's taking so long?" he barked into the radio. Inside, Malcolm moved like a shadow, disarming and neutralizing one attacker after another. His movements were fluid, his focus unshakable. James, too, was in his element, his sharp aim and quick reflexes keeping the attackers off balance. Realizing the tide was turning, Doyle made a fateful decision. He stepped out of the SUV, gun in hand, and stormed toward the safe house. A final confrontation. Doyle entered the safe house, his guards flanking him. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the distant sound of sirens. In the dimly lit room, Malcolm stood waiting, his weapon lowered but ready. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, Brooks," Doyle said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But this ends tonight." Malcolm's gaze was steady. "You're right. It does, but not the way you think." Before Doyle could react, the lights flickered on, revealing the entire room wired with cameras and microphones. James stepped into view, holding a laptop displaying a live broadcast. "We're streaming this to every major outlet in the city," James said. "Your threats, your confession, your crimes, all of it." Doyle's face twisted with rage. "You think this will stop me? I own this city." "Not anymore," Malcolm said. "It's over, Doyle." As the sirens grew louder, Doyle's guards hesitated, their confidence crumbling. Moments later, law enforcement stormed the building, arresting Doyle and his remaining men. The neighborhood erupted in cheers as news of Doyle's capture spread, the dawn of a new beginning. The following morning, the neighborhood gathered in the community center. The air was filled with relief and hope as residents celebrated the end of Doyle's reign of terror. Mrs. Andrews, standing in front of the crowd, spoke with pride. "We stood together and we won. This is our home, and no one will take it from us." Malcolm watched from the back of the room, his heart swelling with pride. His mother joined him, her smile warm and full of gratitude. "You did it, Malcolm," she said. "You protected us." "We all did," Malcolm replied. This was a team effort. As the sun rose over the neighborhood, its light breaking through the lingering shadows, Malcolm knew the battle had changed him. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was part of a community, one that had faced fear and refused to back down. Epilogue. Weeks later, Marcus Doyle stood trial, the evidence collected by Malcolm, and his team sealing his fate. His empire crumbled, and the city began to rebuild from the damage he had caused. For Malcolm, life returned to a new kind of normal. He continued to support the neighborhood, using his skills to strengthen its resilience. Mrs. Brooks, ever the matriarch, became a pillar of hope and leadership, her apple pies a symbol of the community's enduring spirit. In the end, they had proven that courage, unity, and determination could overcome even the most formidable adversaries. And for Malcolm, there was no greater victory. Justice served. As the police escorted Marcus Doyle and his men out of the safe house, the neighborhood erupted into a spontaneous cheer. The years of fear and intimidation were finally over. Doyle's once impenetrable empire had crumbled in a single night, undone by his arrogance and Malcolm's unyielding resolve. Malcolm watched the convoy of police vehicles disappear into the night, his expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. James approached, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You did it," James said, his voice tinged with admiration. "Not just for your mom, but for everyone here." Malcolm nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. They stood up when it mattered most." James grinned. "Yeah, but you gave them the courage to do it." The morning after, as dawn broke, Malcolm returned to his mother's house. The neighborhood was buzzing with activity as residents came together to clean up, rebuild, and celebrate their newfound freedom. Children played in the streets without fear, and neighbors exchanged smiles and handshakes. Inside, Mrs. Brooks was in the kitchen, humming a hymn as she prepared breakfast. When Malcolm walked in, she turned and greeted him with a warm smile. "You look tired," she said, setting a plate of eggs and bacon on the table. "But I suppose that's to be expected after saving the world." Malcolm chuckled softly. "Just the neighborhood, Mom." Mrs. Brooks sat down across from him, her eyes shining with pride. "You did more than that, Malcolm. You gave us hope. You reminded us of what it means to stand together." He nodded, the weight of the past weeks finally lifting. "It's over, Mom. Doyle's done. And so are you for now," she said firmly. "No more running around playing hero. You need rest." Malcolm laughed, raising his hands in surrender. Yes, Mom. Justice and closure. A week later, Malcolm sat in a courtroom, watching as Doyle stood trial. The evidence collected during the raid and the live-streamed confrontation left no room for doubt. Doyle was convicted on multiple charges, including racketeering, conspiracy, and arson. The judge sentenced him to decades in prison, ensuring he would never threaten anyone again. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, shouting questions at Malcolm as he exited with James and Greg, the informant whose testimony had been instrumental. "Mr. Brooks, how does it feel to bring down Marcus Doyle?" one reporter asked. Malcolm paused, glancing at the crowd. "It wasn't just me. This was a community effort." Doyle underestimated the people he tried to intimidate, and they proved stronger than he ever imagined. A new chapter. With Doyle behind bars and his empire dismantled, the neighborhood began to heal. The city allocated funds to repair the damage, and local businesses reopened. The community, once fractured by fear, was now stronger than ever. Malcolm decided to stay in the neighborhood for a while, helping with the rebuilding efforts and offering his expertise to the newly formed Neighborhood Watch. James returned to his own life, but promised to stay in touch, their bond forged even stronger by the battles they had faced together. Mrs. Brooks became a symbol of resilience, her home a gathering place for residents who sought comfort, advice, or just a slice of her famous apple pie. She continued to remind everyone that their strength came from standing together. Epilogue. Strength in unity. Months later, Malcolm stood in the park at the heart of the neighborhood, watching children play and families gather for a community barbecue. The scars left by Doyle's reign were fading, replaced by a renewed sense of hope. Mrs. Brooks approached, carrying a plate of food. "You know," she said, handing it to him, "this place feels different now. Lighter, like a weight's been lifted." "It has," Malcolm agreed, "and it's going to stay that way." She looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "What about you, Malcolm? What's next?" He smiled faintly. "For now, I'm staying here. There's work to be done, and these people, they're family now." Mrs. Brooks nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "You've always been a protector, Malcolm. I'm proud of you." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the park, Malcolm felt a deep sense of peace. The battle was over, but the bonds forged during the fight would endure. The neighborhood was safe, its spirit unbroken, and Malcolm knew that together they could face anything. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to relax, knowing the future was bright, and he had helped make it that way.